turn my mic on. Pursuant to notice, the committee is meeting to consider authorization and oversight plan for the Committee on Homeland Security for the 118th Congress. Without objection, any requests for recorded votes may be rolled to the end of the meeting, and the committee may recess at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. I welcome everybody back for consideration of the Committee on Homeland Security's Authorization and Oversight Plan for the 118th Congress. Rule 10 of the House of Representatives requires each standing committee to adopt and submit an authorization and oversight plan for the 2-year period of the Congress. The plan is put forth before the committee today. The plan put forth before the committee today is an overview of our key priorities for this Congress: addressing the crisis at our southwest border, strengthening our cyber and infrastructure security, and reforming the Department of Homeland Security to maximize its effectiveness for the American people. Additionally, this plan will guide the work of this committee and all our subcommittees over the next 2 years by focusing on a number of other key areas: combating terrorism, examining waste, fraud, and abuse at DHS, countering China and other foreign threats, improving the DHS intelligence enterprise, supporting frontline law enforcement and first responders, enhancing our emergency preparedness and resilience, securing our transportation system, and many others. I'm confident that the areas of focus I discussed, in addition to others, will guide us to do effective and meaningful work for this Congress, just as the American people expect. I urge all members to support this authorization and oversight plan. Without objections, I now recognize the ranking member to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I understand votes have been called.
Did we just get called?
Yeah.
Okay. You want to make your opening comments and then we can come back after that?
Okay.
How's that sound?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you know, this is my 20th year on the committee. I take pride in the role I've played in fostering the committee's bipartisan reputation. That bipartisanship has helped make the nation more secure, even as the Homeland Security threat picture has grown more complex and diverse. In the committee's earliest days, we were primarily focused on preventing future attacks by al-Qaeda and foreign terrorist organizations and maturing the Department of Homeland Security. Since that time, as the intelligence community and DHS has identified domestic terrorism as a significant emerging threat, the committee's oversight plan has evolved too. In the past 2 Congresses, with domestic terrorism firmly identified as a priority area for oversight in our bipartisan plan, we held a combined 12 hearings on varying aspects of this Homeland Security threat. With anti-Semitism on the rise, we held 2 hearings last Congress that specifically focused on threats to the American Jewish community. We were fortunate to have the rabbi from Colleyville, Texas, give us the first congressional testimony after the attack on his synagogue. At a field hearing in New Jersey, we heard from religious leaders and other experts about heightened violent threats against Jews in New Jersey and New York. Domestic terrorism is an emerging threat that resulted in the deaths of 83 people on U.S. soil between 2015 and 2020, roughly the same number who were killed in attacks directly or inspired by foreign terrorist groups. That is why I plan to offer an amendment to ensure that the committee continues to give prioritized attention to domestic terrorism. I'm proud that my amendment is endorsed by the Anti-Defamation League. The absence of language prioritizing oversight of domestic terrorism is, in my view, a fatal flaw in this plan, but I'm also disappointed that the plan seems to reflect the desire to walk back the committee's ongoing oversight of how migrants are treated in DHS custody. I sincerely hope that is not the case. And while I'm pleased the plan indicates continued interest in examining the federal response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, the plan falls short of committing to examining equity issues in our disaster management system that plagued the response. The committee has broad oversight jurisdiction under House Rule 10. Notwithstanding what is this plan, as we commence our work on this committee, Democrats would welcome support for bipartisan collaboration on homeland security issues important to the communities we serve. Finally, I'm concerned by recent reports that other House committees are beginning to target federal workers. The authorization and oversight plan, as written, acknowledges persistent morale problems at DHS and especially within the Transportation Security Administration. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, this committee does not go down the same road as these other committees. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. It looks like they are going to hold votes for us, so without objection and by agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee shall use an amendment roster today. I recognize the ranking member.
So am I understanding?
Yes, sir. We're going to go ahead and just get it done. They're going to hold. They're holding the votes.
Okay. Reserving the right to object, I will not object. Would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster?
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Recognize the ranking member.
Yeah, let me just say that I think there's some confusion because a lot of our members were under the impression when the votes were called, historically people go vote. Now, is there some way that we can get word to all the members that the votes will be held?
Let me check on that just a second. Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member, I appreciate your concern about the confusion on the time and your members not being present. What we'll do then is, as we initially had planned, we'll go vote and then come back after the vote. So the committee stands in recess, and I need everybody back after votes.
Thank you.
The committee will come to order pursuant to notice. I now call up the committee's authorization and oversight plan for the 118th Congress. The measure was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the measure.
Authorization and Oversight Plan of the Committee on Homeland Security for the 118th Congress.
Without objection, the first reading of the measure is dispensed with, and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. It's now in order to consider the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the Authorization and Oversight Plan of the Committee on Homeland Security for the 118th Congress, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm disappointed that this authorization and oversight plan is not a bipartisan product, as has been the committee's past practice. A bipartisan authorization and oversight plan is important to ensure that the committee fully executes its job as DHS lead authorizer. This plan's failure to commit to giving domestic terrorism prioritized attention is an example of what can happen when there's a failure to engage in a bipartisan process. My amendment, which is endorsed by the ADL, inserts 2 critical sentences into the plan to ensure that domestic terrorism and the rise in violent anti-Semitic incidents continue to get the attention they deserve. This is not a partisan issue. For many years now, former President Trump and Biden officials have come before this committee and given unequivocal testimony that domestic terrorism is a persistent and pervasive threat. The Trump administration's October 2020 Homeland Threat Assessment stated, and I quote, "The primary terrorist threat inside the United States will stem from lone offenders and small cells of individuals, including domestic violent extremists and foreign terrorist-inspired homegrown violent extremists." In 2019, FBI Director Wray testified that domestic terrorism cases were, quote, "at an all-time high" at this committee's annual Worldwide Threats hearing. At that same hearing, then acting secretary installed by former President Trump agreed with Director Wray and went on to say, quote, "one of the most significant emerging threats over the past years has been domestic actors' adoption of terrorist techniques," unquote. And well, we know what happened on January 6, 2021. After that horrific day, Director Wray again cautioned Congress about domestic terrorism. He testified, quote, "January 6 was not an isolated event. The problem of domestic terrorism has been metastasizing across the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon," unquote. Since the beginning of 2010, domestic violent extremists adhering to various violent extremist ideologies have conducted at least 47 lethal attacks that have killed 152 people in the United States. Many of these attacks have been driven by anti-Semitism, like the murder of 11 Jewish people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. The Director of National Intelligence 2021 Threat Assessment stated that U.S.-based lone actors, quote, "pose a greater immediate domestic threat," unquote, than domestic terrorism and anti-Semitism as significant homeland security threats, and commits to examining threats to Americans and the homeland from domestic violent extremists. Such oversight is critical given what terrorism experts have told us about how anti-Semitism is common to a wide array of U.S.-based extremist groups, from violent Islamist extremists to neo-Nazis, skinheads, and white supremacist extremists to the far-left extremists. Finally, my amendment would ensure that the committee continues to examine the intersection of techniques and tactics used by foreign terrorist organizations
At this time. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of the things important about this committee, it should not be, and it's, I believe, not a partisan committee where Democrats and Republicans come in to debate the mission, but rather we debate on how we get there. We're here to protect American citizens around the world, including here at home. Domestic terrorism is a challenge for all of us, and I don't think there's any of us here, any part of this country that have not been touched by domestic terrorism. As we look to frame the mission of Homeland Security, we cannot overlook the things that have been happening in our own backyard. Our children, our families, whether attending church, or do a good job. If we are to do a good job in protecting our communities, it's not only talking about people in some distant lands. Sadly, we've got to talk about being vigilant of what happens in our own backyards. Not a day goes by when after a shooting, my constituents come to me and say, Lou, what can we do about this? Please do something. I'm tired of being stressed. I'm tired of having to go to church and not feeling safe. I'm concerned about my children, our neighbors' children, not feeling safe in school. That is why I support this amendment, and I do hope, for the sake of Americans, we look at terrorists not only foreign, but domestic as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Does any other member want to comment on the bill or the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Swalwell is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And I move to strike the last word. And I want to offer my support for Ranking Member Thompson's important amendment. And I offer it because right now, domestic terrorism, violent extremism, anti-Semitism are all on the rise and are becoming the greatest threats to the security of our constituents. And it's regardless of the political backgrounds of our constituents. A right-wing violent extremist who's carrying out the attack, they don't give a rip about who is collaterally also affected if it's, for example, a mass shooting. And we've seen a sharp rise in these types of incidents and the threats to our homeland. In fact, and you don't have to take my word for it, by the way, these are the words of the FBI director that former President Donald Trump appointed, who said that the greatest threat to American homeland security today is the rise in domestic terrorism. According to testimony from the Anti-Defamation League's CEO, extremist violence is coming from right-wing groups, white supremacists, anti-government radicals, and conspiracy theory believers. In 2018, a violent, anti-Semitic domestic terrorist entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and murdered 11 people, leaving 6 others injured and countless more traumatized. In 2019, both a mosque and a synagogue in California were targeted by a domestic terrorist who spread anti-Semitic tropes and was inspired by a mass shooting that had occurred at a mosque prior in New Zealand. In the same year in El Paso, our colleague Ms. Escobar's district, a gunman purposely targeted a Hispanic community, killing 23 and wounding 23 more. In the attacker's manifesto, he said and posted racist conspiracy theories about a Hispanic, quote, Hispanic invasion of Texas, and claimed to be defending his country from ethnic and cultural replacement. And of course, recently, after the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, an armed man fired upon an FBI headquarters in Cincinnati following his radicalized and violent beliefs. So this not only protects our constituents, it protects our law enforcement, the men and women who walk the beat, who are easy targets as they're in our community protecting us to violent extremism. This committee has a duty to exercise through unbiased oversight over the Department of Homeland Security, and we can't do that without focusing on the threats that our FBI and Homeland Security Secretary have told us we're facing. So with that, I support the amendment from the gentleman, our ranking member from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, and I yield back.
Mr. Ramirez, I think you were next, and Ms. Jackson-Lee will be after you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I move to strike the last word as well. First, I want to say thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for your leadership and your attention to this very critical issue. We must recognize that violence has no place in our society, and it threatens life and liberty. Specifically, white supremacist violence poses a real and deadly threat and must be swiftly condemned, following by dedicating our resources, our personnel, our capacity to eradicating it in all forms. As we discuss today how to move forward with oversight of the committee, I urge my colleagues to prioritize resource allocation that is commensurate with the threat to ensure that one group is not targeted over the other. We must ensure that we always protect the people's civil rights and their civil liberty. Thank you again for your leadership on this issue. I'm committed to working with you to create equitable future for all of us. I support this amendment, and I yield back.
Lady yields her time, and we'll recognize Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas next. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the ranking member for this very thoughtful amendment and express my concern about the potential modification of this amendment. We are the Homeland Security Committee. We were organized in the horrific, heinous attack on American soil in 9/11. Those of us who have been on this committee since that time have taken that duty with great sincerity and respect. We honored those who left their homes and joined the United States military to fight on behalf of this nation. So many that we've come across who said they immediately left their homes because of the horror of what they saw. I was one of the first members to go to Ground Zero in the midst of recovery, not rescue, but the time of recovering of remains. At that time, planes were still grounded. We took every moment in this committee to deal with international terrorism. I've sat alongside of Chairman Thompson as we looked at the numbers of terrorists from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and beyond. We did not remain silent on our opposition to those tactics. How can we claim the high honor of protecting the national security of this nation if we do not view it in every manner of attack that might come against the people of this country? My colleague just mentioned the Tree of Life. This committee went to the Tree of Life Synagogue and met those people who had been terrorized. The committee went to Charleston by way of the respect to funerals that were the result of a perpetrator who wanted to start a race war, a terrorist, and killed 9 worshipers. I met the families of those in Buffalo whose perpetrator claimed the replacement theory and terrorized Black Americans. So domestic terrorism has many facets, including what is happening now to the AAPI community that is being terrorized, our Asian, Pacific, and others community, including members of Congress. Cite the FBI director appointed by President Trump, who testified in front of this committee on November 15, 2022, provided the testimony that racially motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race were the primary source of lethal attacks perpetrated by domestic violent extremists in recent years. His testimony and the facts on the ground in this country provide credence that Homeland Security Committee oversight plan must include this amendment. The New York Times reports that the extremist violence is the country's top domestic terrorist threat, according to a 3-year investigation by the staff members of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. Further, attacks has been predominantly perpetrated by white supremacist and anti-government extremist individuals and groups. It was an anti-government extremist that bombed the innocent people in Oklahoma. We cannot run away from threats, no matter from whom they may come. And I believe that our oversight plan must enunciate the parameters of what we might look at. It doesn't dictate, it doesn't say we'll get to look at every aspect of the oversight plan, but it gives us a reasoned perspective. And certainly, many of you, my friends on the other side of the aisle, you watched the January 6 hearings, and I know that in spite of, you saw some very professionally presented facts of the tragedy of January 6. So our eyes cannot give us the untruth. Our eyes can see. And on the foundation of this committee, founded in the ashes of 9/11, of which we have risen, our commitment was to fight terror wherever we could find it, to protect the homeland. This amendment deserves the respect of our colleagues, and I hope you will support it because this is the very underpinnings of what this committee is to stand for. I ask my colleagues to support the Thompson Amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman is recognized. Mr. Bishop from North Carolina.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if I might propose to yield to the ranking member for an answer to the question, which is that in the proposed oversight plan at the bottom of page 5, it already says the committee will also respond.
Specifically, which it does not say anything about it now.
Well, then that sort of redoubles my concern about what the addition is for. I certainly think anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violent incidents certainly are a proper subject for the consideration of the committee, but there are anti-Christian acts. There are acts that are predicated on people's race. There are acts that are predicated on people's sexual orientation. There's a panoply of things. I don't know a reason to single out one of them. The committee has already proposed in its base plan entirely covers the subject. I think that it's surplusage, and then by singling one thing out, it subordinates all other possibilities that are included within the term. Therefore, I could not support the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I think I have Mr. Payne up next. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Mentor to me since my arrival here 11 years ago. This amendment speaks clearly, and the oversight plan, unfortunately offered by Chairman Green and his staff, fails to give the necessary attention to specific sectors within the Department of Homeland Security, the third largest federal department that requires proper oversight from this body. The director of the FBI, Chris Wray, told this committee that there was a staggering volume of domestic terrorism cases, and it had become one of the top priorities for the Bureau. My friends on the other side of the aisle, I don't understand why we shy away from this. There seems to be a reluctance to deal with the latter. I, on several occasions in this committee, know that this committee came out of the ashes of 9/11. But I tend to remind everyone in this room, domestic terrorists this country has known. Children died in Oklahoma City. Families were decimated in Oklahoma City. So let us not forget. We'll never forget 9/11. And we need to give honor to the Americans that lost their lives at Oklahoma City as well. Ranking Member Thompson has offered an amendment that intends to ensure that this committee stays on watch and remains on the job by prioritizing the protection of the homeland from all threats in its oversight mission. More than anything, his amendment acknowledges the rise in violent anti-Semitic attacks that terrorism experts have identified as predominantly US-based extremist groups. From violent Islamist extremists to neo-Nazis, white supremacist extremists, and skinheads to the far left extremists. We need to do the entire job, not just a select members' amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I think I have Mr. Ivy and then Mr. Carter, and I think, okay, magazine or two, okay. Mr. Ivy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. I do too support Mr. Thompson's amendment. I do want to make a couple comments that are sort of tangential to that but relevant. I take Mr. Bishop's comments with respect to the language that's already in the rule. I'm hoping that what that means is, in the event that Mr. Thompson's language isn't adopted, that the committee is going to commit to move forward with the investigations that began in the last Congress with respect to the Homeland Security Inspector General. There were a series of letters that were issued by Mr. Thompson and Ms. Maloney, I believe, with respect to issues dealing with January 6th, the Inspector General's failure to provide information to this committee with respect to the Secret Service text messages that were dated January 5th and 6th, specifically the deletion of these text messages that were obviously relevant to the investigation that was going on after the attack that took place on the Capitol on January 6th. The Inspector General disclosed to the committee that he knew about these texts that have been deleted, but he waited more than a year to tell that to the committee. And he only did it in response to ongoing inquiries from Mr. Thompson and Ms. Maloney. So, I can make these available, but I'm sure they're a matter of committee records. The August 1, 2022 letter to Joseph Kufari, who is the Inspector General, and also the August 16th letter in response to Mr. Kufari disclosing that after he had failed to disclose that information, they did follow-up requests, and he failed to respond to those requests and produce the documents that were requested. So with respect to domestic terrorism, I know we're talking about what language is appropriate. I share Mr. Thompson's view, but we need to get to the bottom of what was going on with that Inspector General who carried over from the Trump administration and is still in place, who still hasn't disclosed why he failed to provide the information to the committee with respect to the deletion of those text messages, which arguably I think would fall in the obstruction to justice category. If you're disclosing information that's clearly relevant to an ongoing felony investigation, I think that's obstruction to justice. And by the way, with respect to the prosecutions of the cases for January 6th, the Department of Justice, I think, has done an outstanding job in moving forward with, I want to say, over 700 cases so far, and they've done a number of jury trials there. But I think that the information that was developed by the January 6th committee here in the House in the last Congress was significant and dramatic and important. I think it's important for us to follow up on those investigations and the information that came out of that, as well as the hundreds of prosecutions that have been made by the Department of Justice. If we really want to get to the bottom of domestic terrorism, regardless of whose language we adopt, I think that we must, as part of the mission for this committee. I hope that that's part of the mission that we will take on, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. I think I have Mr. Carter from Louisiana next. Ranking member,
Move to strike the last word, and I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member.
the ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding about the amendment. In reference to Mr. Bishop's comments, since 2015, individuals engaged in domestic terrorism have taken more lives in the U.S. homeland than individuals acting on behalf of all other foreign terrorist organizations combined. That means that domestic terrorists are killing more people in the United States since 2015 than everything else happening overseas. So it's a clear and present danger to those of us who live here in America. And what my amendment is doing is trying to highlight the documented tragedies that's occurring and to continue to focus on domestic terrorism by the committee. Now, we've always had it in every other oversight plan. It's just that there's no reference to domestic terrorism in this plan, and that's why my amendment is moving in that direction. I yield back.
Would gentleman yields? I have Mr. Magaziner next from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman. I support this amendment. I think it's very important. But before I speak on the amendment, I just want to say there are a lot of things in the plan that has been presented by the majority that I agree with and that I'm excited to work across the aisle with all of you on. There are a number of threats to the homeland that we need to work together to address, many of which are incorporated in this plan. And so I thank you for that. But there is a glaring omission. As the ranking member just said, since 2015, more Americans killed by domestic extremism than by foreign terrorist organizations. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention still to foreign terrorist organizations, but we need to incorporate domestic extremism into our work. The list is compelling. In the last 3 years, 80 Americans have been killed by acts of violence motivated by domestic extremism, with white supremacy and anti-government extremism being among the most common motivating factors. Look at what happened on Steve Scalise, going all the way back to the Oklahoma City bombing. The list goes on, and we do ourselves a disservice and we do the American people a disservice if we pretend that these threats do not exist. They do. And it sends a dangerous message to those who are considering acts of violence against fellow Americans if they see this committee appearing to downplay the threat. And so I encourage everyone, this should not be a difficult vote. All right, this should not be a difficult vote. These are clear dangers to the homeland. Americans are being killed by extreme organizations. And these are not just lone wolves all the time either. The attempted kidnapping of the governor of Michigan was a coordinated, organized plot by a group of people working together. So this is not just a case of lone people on their own doing terrible things. We have to take organized domestic extremism seriously if we can be honest with the American people that we are doing our jobs and keeping them safe. And so I thank Mr. Thompson for offering this amendment. I encourage everyone to support it. And I look forward to working with this committee on the issue of domestic extremism, along with all of the other threats to our country that we also need to focus on. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I think I have a request for Mr. Higgins. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield time to my colleague, Mr. Bishop.
I thank the gentleman from there have been a number of other types of incidents, and I see no warrant for singling out one. So then subsequently, Mr. Thompson came back on someone else's time and said, well, the reason, I think if I understood or paraphrased what he said, it was a matter of of emphasizing. I've conflated now the thoughts of Mr. Magaziner in his last comments, but those comments also, in both those times, I've heard other members of the minority speak about white supremacy, and now Mr. Magaziner, anti-government extremism. You cited the example of the governor from Michigan. Well, two people who were indicted and prosecuted in the alleged plot against the governor of Michigan were acquitted for entrapment, apparently. That is to say, they asserted an entrapment defense predicated on the fact that the FBI conducted a massive plot. We don't know the full scope of it because they won't answer questions about it, but media accounts indicate, and the jury apparently found in 2 cases, that they had a massive scheme with over a dozen FBI agents. They took people on the margins of life, one who was living in the basement of a strip center, of a shopping center, in an underground or basement space that didn't have running water, some guy on the margins of life. They created a militia. They drew people into a militia. They created a plot. They financed it. They took folks out to conduct surveillance, purportedly at the vacation residence of the governor. Look at there, but yeah,
would the gentleman yield for a question on that?
Well, we'll yield. Well, it's not my time to yield. Mr. Higgins will agree to that. I certainly will love to hear your question.
I continue to yield my time to my colleague, Mr. Bishop, and then I'll reclaim my time when he's done.
Then I would say, and here's what I'd say about getting back to the substance of the amendment. I see the reason for having in the oversight plan this statement concerning the threat from homegrown violent extremists. That is to say, we're going to look at that. The amendment adds absolutely nothing to that in terms of substance. The only thing that could be said, and perhaps Mr. Magaziner is trying to say it, is that you believe there should be greater emphasis to that. We should go out and make sure we talk about white supremacy and talk about anti-government extremism and talk about Paul Pelosi because some nutcase in San Francisco who is bombed out on drugs did something horrible to Paul Pelosi. I'm not sure that indicates some underlying current in the United States of America. In fact, I reject that it does. I think what we have an obligation to do, in addition to addressing the issue, which we already have in the base document, is to maintain balance. And it just happens to be the case, Ms. Jackson Lee and I have been shuttling back and forth between a mirror image proceeding on the Oversight Plan and the Judiciary Committee. And there have been similar proposals to kind of bring up some hot-button smear that unbalances the text, takes something out of context and creates an emphasis and thereby subordinates all sorts of other areas or other examples covered by the same language that should not be singled out for any reason. So I fully support the underlying document that talks about homegrown violent extremists, but to this moment I haven't heard anything that this language does other than perhaps say more and pick out one specific group that's been victimized, which is Jewish people. And I don't understand a reason to pick those people out and diminish the victimization of other people. So I don't understand the reason for it, and I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for yielding time so that I could explore that further. But I'll leave those questions out, and I hope someone will address them.
I reclaim my time. I thank the gentleman for bringing up the FBI. And Mr. Chairman, let me say, I, for one, take domestic terrorism very seriously, which is why, let me just advise Director Ray that my file on the FBI is thicker than the FBI's file on me.
The gentleman yields. Is there anybody else who wishes to make a comment? Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus is recognized.
Thank you. I support this amendment because I do believe it adds to the body of the order before us. You seem to be conflating homegrown terror threats. Now, those are different from domestic threats. Homegrown terror threats are those that are understood, and this is common knowledge, to be U.S. persons who are inspired or affiliated with a foreign terrorist group like ISIS, not a domestic actor who's carrying out violence as a result of domestic grievances. Those are two very different things, and the latter is just not recognized in the material before us, and that's why we need this amendment. So I would urge members to support the amendment because it does add to the context. It's not redundant language, and it is an important part of the direction of this committee and the history of this committee and what it's been doing to carry out the duty of oversight, both of homegrown terror threats and domestic terror.
So I just want to let everybody know that it looks like votes have been called. If there's not a lot more debate, we can probably get this done. I think we'll get going and get it done and get to votes. The leadership has indicated they will hold for as much as they can. But at this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, representing Michigan, serving in the Michigan House, you know, I saw firsthand ranking members' amendment, also asked that we strike the last word, and I would like to yield a remaining part of my time to the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from Detroit, Michigan, and just briefly want to say that on February 8th, 2023, the FBI issued a joint intelligence bulletin highlighting which is captured by the ranking member's provision. The FBI said, highlighting the continued interest by some RMVEs, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, in conducting attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly electric infrastructure. These are distinctively different from the bland or the limiting the language to violent extremism. The domestic terrorism is supported by facts. Homegrown violent terrorism, domestic violent extremists. And we should not run away from those words. But I just want to take a moment. My colleague from North Carolina is correct. We have been engaging in the Judiciary Committee, and I appreciate his work on an amendment that we ultimately voted on together. But I have to raise the question and concern to my friend. For the people who have been impacted, for the families and persons that we saw in the Tree of Life, with the sleight of hand that suggested, oh, it has anti-Semitism or not. The families of those killed in Buffalo are in pain from this day until the rest of their lives. Their loved ones are dead. The families in El Paso, whose funerals some of us went to, and this perpetrator, wanted to kill Hispanics, and he did more than 20. They will hurt for the rest of their lives. Domestic violence kills, it hurts, it harms, and it is undermining the national security of this nation. I conclude by simply saying, please read this amendment of Mr. Thompson and realize that it is an amendment that we all can support, but let us not give short shrift to the people who are dead because they were violated by a domestic violent terrorist. They are real, they exist, it is frightening, and we as Homeland Security members must join with the Homeland Security Department and all of our law enforcement to cease and desist. I yield back to the gentleman from Detroit.
Gentlemen, are you reclaiming your time or yielding?
I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Mr. Guest seeks recognition.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an all-for-Oster amendment to the amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report and distribute the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Thompson to the authorization and oversight plan of the Committee on Homeland Security for the 118th Congress, offered by Mr. Guest.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. I now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we heard moments ago from Mr. Payne. He set out and reminded this committee of the important work of the committee, that this committee was formed out of 9/11, that this committee was formed to protect all Americans, that our job is to examine all threats, both foreign and domestic, Mr. Payne went on to say that we should stay on watch from all threats. We heard from Mr. Magazine when he said that we are to protect all Americans from all threats. Ms. Lee when she said that we are to examine every possible manner of attack. What this amendment would do is this amendment would not focus on either foreign or domestic, but would identify all of them as being equally important to protect the American public from each of those. It would preserve the language within the amendment dealing with anti-Semitic incidents. I believe that this amendment to the amendment better defines and lays out our vision to protect the American public. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is there anyone who wants to speak on the amendment to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
The amendment before us strikes all references to domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremists. I filed my amendment yesterday on behalf of the Democrats to ensure that the committee continues to examine what national and homeland security experts have told us that is a persistent and pervasive threat. It is not the same as the threat posed by foreign terrorist organizations, which already get appropriate attention in the plan. We came into the 118th Congress with significant changes in the composition of this panel. Democrats submitted our amendments to ensure that, notwithstanding those changes, we can continue the committee's bipartisan record of tackling domestic terrorism from the last Congress and urgent homeland security issue. The Republican amendment would do nothing to ensure that the Committee on Homeland Security would continue to prioritize the fight against domestic terrorism. And one of the things that created this committee, there was specific language that talked about foreign terrorists as well as domestic terrorists. We've always had it as a part of the oversight plan. So any reduction in acknowledging that is weakening the overall oversight plan of the committee. And all we're trying to do is keep the language where it's always been, and based on the testimony that we've heard from our intelligence gathering agency, as well as our domestic law enforcement agency, the FBI, domestic terrorism is on the rise. The statistics say that. So it's important, I think, from oversight perspective, that we do just that. And for this reason, I oppose the perfecting amendment.
The gentleman yields. Is there any other comment on the amendment to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, briefly.
Mr. Magaziner is recognized.
So I oppose the amendment, and let me just start by saying, I heard Mr. Bishop say that he could not see that there was an underlying domestic extremist threat that superseded any of the other threats that we, as a committee, are charged with examining. I would just echo Mr. Thompson that since 2015, more Americans have been killed in violence motivated by domestic extremism than foreign terrorist organizations. That doesn't mean we stop paying attention to foreign terrorist organizations, but as a committee, the language we use and what we emphasize is important. Should we not be putting the most attention on the area where the greatest threats are? Now, to document forward where domestic extremism is essentially an afterthought and other threats are given more real estate in the document sends the wrong message. It sends the message that we are not focused on where the largest problems are. And as far as this amendment to the amendment goes, listen, what concerns me, and I think many of us, is this attempt to shift blame away who are killing Americans and toward the law enforcement agencies and those officers who are risking their lives to crack down on those individuals and those organizations that are committing acts of violence. So For that reason, I join Mr. Thompson in opposing this amendment, and I encourage the committee, let's look at all of it, but let's make sure that we are putting the bulk of our focus where the bulk of the problems are and not minimizing some at the expense of others.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Ivy is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. With respect to this amendment, I had a couple of concerns. First, as the ranking member stated, the removal of the word domestic I thought was troubling. I appreciate Mr. Bishop's comments with respect to the not being specific with respect to some of the entities that we wanted to focus on. But I would note that in the language that's included in the chairman's mark, it includes specific references to, with respect to overseas threats, ISIS, Al-Shabaab. So it makes specific references to specific terrorist organizations. So I don't know that there's a problem with us being specific with respect to the domestic terrorist threat either. To the specific language, I'm a little concerned about the language of the amendment, politicized federal agencies. I don't know that that's necessarily a focus of if we're actually trying to get at domestic terrorism. I think really if you want to focus on federal agencies, I mentioned earlier, I think we need to investigate and complete moving forward with the Inspector General at the department. That got started in the last Congress. I think it's critical for us to move forward with that. But I would just express some caution with respect to painting the whole agency with that kind of a broad brush when you might have individuals who are involved in misconduct. I was also a little surprised to see a reference to the First Amendment solely because I think we want to make sure we protect Americans' rights beyond the First Amendment. I think the entire Constitution should get that kind of protection, as well about plot with respect to kidnapping and assassinating the governor as some sort of big entrapment operation. That language, I'm concerned that a case like that, which I think is clearly relevant and within the jurisdiction of this committee, that I have colleagues on the other side of the aisle that might think that that's not relevant. So I oppose the language for that reason. For those reasons, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields, and I just want to say that if we don't vote soon, we'll need to come back. So understanding that, we'll do whatever we have to do and be here as late as y'all want to be. But we're going to need to vote soon if we don't want to do that, because from what I'm hearing from the floor, they're not going to hold it much longer for us. So with that, is there anyone else who wants to comment on the bill? If there is no further debate, the question is on amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Guest. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chair,
You're recognized.
I request a recorded
A
vote.
recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall. Mr. Higgins. Aye. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Aye. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Aye. Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Aye. Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Aye. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green. Aye. Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Aye. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. LaLota. Aye. Mr. LaLota votes aye. Mr. Ezell.
Aye.
Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito.
Aye.
Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee. Aye. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell. Aye. Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong.
Aye.
Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen.
Aye.
Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane.
Aye.
Mr. Crane votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Nay.
Mr. Thompson votes nay. Ms. Jackson Lee. No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne. No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar.
No.
Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner.
No.
Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy. No. Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman. No. Mr. Goldman votes no. Mr. Garcia. Mrs. Ramirez. Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 yeas, 14 noes.
The ayes have it, and the amendment to the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion, the chair, the ayes have it, and the
Chair.
amendment is agreed to. You're recognized, Mr. Thompson?
Chair, I have a recorded vote.
A recorded vote? Okay. A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings, a recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Jimenez? Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. Pfluger? Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green? Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. LaLota? Mr. LaLota votes aye. Mr. Ezell?
Aye.
Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito?
Aye.
Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell? Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong? Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen?
Aye.
Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane?
Aye.
Mr. Crane votes aye. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne? No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar?
No.
Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner? No. Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy? No. Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman? No. Mr. Goldman votes no. Mr. Garcia? Mrs. Ramirez? No. Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. Garcia?
How's the chair recorded?
You are not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 yeas, 15 noes.
The ayes have it, and the amendment as amended is adopted. Are there any further amendments? Hearing none, the question is now on adoption of the committee's authorization and oversight plan as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measure is adopted.
Mr. Chair.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest? Aye. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez? Yes. Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. Pfluger? Yes. Mr. Pfluger votes yes. Mr. Garbarino? Yes. Mr. Garbarino votes yes. Ms. Green? Yes. Ms. Green votes yes. Mr. Gonzalez? Aye. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. LaLota? Aye. Mr. LaLota votes aye. Mr. Ezell?
Aye.
Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito?
Aye.
Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell? Aye. Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong? Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen?
Aye.
Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane?
Aye.
Mr. Crane votes aye. Mr. Thompson?
Nay.
Mr. Thompson votes nay. Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne? No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar? No. Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner? No. Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy? No. Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes nay. Mr. Garcia? Mrs. Ramirez? No. Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. Garcia?
All right. How's the chair recorded?
You are not recorded.
The chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 yeas, 14 noes.
The committee needs to be in order. Without objection, the motion, the clerk will report, or the ayes have it, and the measure is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes the consideration of the measures noticed by the committee for today.
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11 and Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on the measures ordered reported by the committee today.
So ordered. There being no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.